in Minnesota's law, unsure how this happened, but erectile dysfunction medication got added to the list of drugs that were illegal to prescribe online, paired with a number of dangerous drugs that made sense. And so we were blocked from operating in that product line in Minnesota for a while, and we decided to offensively build relationships, go to the state, several times, and kind of figure out what was going on there and see if there was appetite to do something about that, especially as a company like Ro had really flourished and had done some incredible things and had really positive health outcomes for patients. And the thing that actually, I think, tipped it over the edge where folks started taking it seriously, we presented data on the prevalence of erectile dysfunction in military vets. And then presented data on lack of access for those military vets to get the care that they need for ED. And that kind of won the day for us.
What do you need to know about managing government affairs for heavily regulated, high-growth brands? Is it perhaps the most interesting part of a GC's job? And will it actually lead you to Washington, D.C., or maybe other slightly less glamorous cities? Today, we are joined on the Abstract by my friend Adam Greenberg, a startup GC extraordinaire. Adam has worked for a few consumer brands that I think that we are all familiar with, especially if you spend any time in New York City or on the subway looking at ads. He was the second legal hire at Warby Parker, the D2C glasses company, and was later promoted to run the legal team as the head of legal and public policy. He was also the first legal hire and general counsel at the digital health platform Ro, which used to be called Roman, where he helped scale the company to 800 employees and a $7 billion valuation. And most recently, he was the first legal hire, general counsel, and the interim chief people officer at Blank Street, which is a high-growth coffee startup. These days, Adam is spending his time as an advisor and fractional GC to a number of high-growth startups, while he keeps an eye out for what GC gig might be next. Adam, thanks for joining me for this episode of The Abstract.
Thanks for having me. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah. Okay. Your journey in the world of startups begins with Warby Parker. I feel like when you joined, that was like one of the coolest, not that it's not cool anymore, but one of the coolest companies out there to be working for, one of the fastest sort of growing brands in the world. How'd you land that gig?
It was very cool. It still is very cool. I love that company. It was a combination of dumb luck and some strategy. So I was working at Skadden at the time in the New York office, and had started my career at Skadden in the litigation group. After about a year in that group, I took a year off and came back to California and did a 1-year clerkship on the Ninth Circuit. And after that experience, I felt like I wanted to build out my skill set beyond litigation a bit more, and was already starting to think about what a career and a life outside of a law firm, still being a lawyer, but outside of a law firm might look like. And Skadden was nice enough to let me back into the firm in New York in their real estate transactions group, and spent under 3 years, just under 3 years in that group. And during that time period, really started to get interested in in-house work and how to set myself on a path to being a general counsel one day. And I started to look at in-house opportunities in the real estate world and just didn't feel incredibly passionate about it. And I had already asked Skadden if I could change groups once. So I was like, I might as well give it a shot and try again. And I think it was at a recruiting event and cornered the head of the IP and tech transactions group and was like, it seems like your group's awesome, doing really interesting work. I see people getting really interesting jobs in-house outside of this group, and how about it? Can you let me in? And I was lucky enough they let me in that group as well. That was a little bit strategic, and spent under a year in that group, and was at the office working one night and saw a public posting for the role was titled commercial counsel at Warby Parker. It's the second lawyer they were hiring. And interestingly, in the job description, they had called out a preference for someone with some litigation experience, some real estate experience, because the company was starting to build out its brick and mortar stores, and some tech transactions experience. And I might have been the only attorney fickle enough at the time in New York to have spent time in all three of those groups at a firm like Skadden. And I applied. I didn't really know anyone at the company at the time directly, but hustled to find as many people that were connected somehow to the company, to their investors, to their founders, to their outside counsel, and hit up everyone. And was very lucky, very fortunate to get that job. And my first week, I think, when I met Neil Blumenthal, who's one of the co-founders, co-CEOs, he must have been hit up by, I don't know, 5 people that somehow knew me and knew him also. He's like, "Whoa, you have a lot of people in your corner who really wanted you to have this job." So, it was definitely an exercise in getting your resume to the top of the pile.
I love that. That's a great story. I mean, on so many levels, right? Like not knowing exactly where the experience is going to lead you that ends up being super useful, being willing to ask for something, even if someone might say no. I mean, people do whole webinars on what you've just talked about, which is how can I get my resume to the top of the pile? How can I leverage my network for that? We are going to talk less about the real estate side and the IP side today, and a little bit more about the government affairs side, which I think is really interesting. I haven't had a ton of conversations on this podcast around government affairs yet. And I also haven't really had one in the context of like D2C brands like you've worked for, which I think people might sometimes forget are regulated or forget have government affairs challenges. What are some of the sort of unique public policy issues that Warby was dealing with or having to think through?
So I think it might be a surprise to some people that Warby operates in a pretty regulated space, actually. The practice of opticianry. So those are the folks often licensed, credentialed, who work in optical shops, who are making sure the glasses fit your face appropriately, making sure you could see appropriately through them, taking measurements, fitting you, adjusting the glasses. In many states, that's a regulated practice and a licensed practice. So we had a large a group of opticians working at the stores. We were also innovators in selling a prescription product, which glasses are also FDA regulated as a medical device online. So there were a host of regulatory areas to understand and keep in mind there. And optometry, the eye doctors who are giving you eye exams, we were also performing those exams in some of our stores. A clinical practice, licensed, also pretty heavily regulated. So from the early days, my work included understanding the regulatory environment and helping build the business model in a way that took that into account. But my public policy and government affairs work didn't really start to take up a large area, a large portion of my time until the back half of my tenure at Warby, when I was part of a small team that was helping launch the company's first virtual care product, an online vision test.
Cool.
I, as the lawyer, wasn't launching anything. I was advising the folks who were building it. But the first version of it was this really innovative, first to the market, patented technology where you're syncing your phone to your computer, you're standing 10 feet away and seeing some imagery on your computer and answering questions based on how you're seeing that imagery on your phone. On the back end, an eye doctor is taking a look at the results and potentially, based on how you're seeing, writing you a new prescription for your glasses.
Wow.
So to build out this product, and we wanted to launch it as many states as possible, I first had to get smart on state-by-state telehealth laws and regulations. Healthcare primarily is governed at the state level, unless you're in the Medicare space, health insurance space. Most of the day-to-day practice, delivery of medicine and healthcare is regulated by state statutes and regulations implemented by state boards. So the first order of business was getting my arms around existing laws and regulations, both general telehealth. What are the tools that patients can access? What are the tools that providers can access to provide care remotely? And then specific to what we called ocular care or optical care, were there any laws and regulations specific to the delivery of ocular care through virtual methods? And that influenced which states we were initially launching in.
So it's taking you to a lot of state houses as opposed to DC. I mean, I think when people think about lobbying, a lot of the times they're thinking like, in fact, they may not even be thinking, hey, I'm going to the FDA or I'm going to the Department of Transportation or what have you. They're thinking like Capitol Hill, Congress people, senators, right? What do you think is misunderstood or underappreciated about doing good work or going out and engaging on a state-by-state level?
Yeah, great question. I'll give you a little bit of background of how I even got in, how that work at Warby really transpired. When we were building the product, my focus wasn't on lobbying or government affairs at all. It was really just understanding the existing regulatory environment. But when word got out that we were planning on launching this product, the optometry industry, so the folks who are typically giving you eye exams, often own an optical shop right next to the office where they're giving you the eye exam and trying to sell you glasses or contact lenses. They found out we were launching this really innovative product that they feared would undercut their business model, which is to get you in the chair, give you an eye exam, and then walk you next door and sell you a pair of glasses that are typically 2, 3, 4, 5x the amount that you're spending on a pair of Warby Parker glasses.
Right.
And their approach was to draft model legislation, take that model legislation state by state, and if passed, it would have essentially outlawed this new technology. It would have required a patient to be in person, face-to-face in front of an eye doctor in order for that eye doctor to be able to, under their standard of care, write a new prescription for glasses or contact lenses. And this is before we launched the product. So we wanted to make sure that there wasn't a national or almost national regulatory barrier to launching this really cool product that we thought was great for customers, great for providers, before we even set to launch it. So I was coming from Skadden. I was a corporate lawyer. I'd never done any policy work or lobbying work prior to that. And we started to see these bills pop up at state houses across the country. And at that time, I was the only lawyer at the company, and the founders were like, "We don't have a policy team. I guess here's a little bit of budget. Go figure it out. Go see what you can do." So that's what I did as a scrappy startup lawyer. Called in a lot of favors, tried to make friends who could educate me on what the hell I should be doing, even to start, where to start. And for better part of a year, spent a significant portion of my time traveling to these state houses, sometimes hiring local lobbyists and having conversations with legislators on both sides of the aisle, educating them on the product we were building, why policies they were considering would be harmful to their constituents, both their constituents who are providers and their constituents who are customers and patients, and try to keep open this business model and not get blocked in states that were important to us. So back to your question was about what did I learn
Yeah.
about the work during that time period. So first thing I learned was if you're hiring a lobbyist in a state and advocating certain any policy issues at a state level, that's public information. There's a public database that shows which companies hire which lobbyists. So I would go to those databases in states that we were thinking about advocating in and operating in, and see who other innovators who were disrupting and potentially threatening the traditional business models of incumbents in the space, who they were hiring. So I'd look at Airbnb, Uber,
Smart.
Lyft, Amazon, and because I had a feeling that these lobbyists understood how to work with tech companies who were building creative products, who were taking on big players, who were much better funded, much better connected at the political level, and they'd be the right people to help me strategize how is it even possible to go after these new bills and try to influence them, in some instances try to kill them. That's where I started. Also made some friends at Uber, at Lyft, at Airbnb, who would just give me some guidance on how to even go about starting to think about creating a policy program and a government affairs program, and would cold call these lobbyists and say, hey, Warby was maybe 5-6 years old at the time, so it was becoming a household name, certainly in major metropolitan areas, but not in places like Kentucky, which was a state that I ended up spending a lot of time in. So I'd explain who I was, what the company was, the issue we were working on, and then try to get a sense of were these the right folks who had the right connections and can get me in the right rooms to have conversations to impact policy, to impact which direction this bill was actually going. I was surprised by, as a small company with not a massive budget to be spending, we weren't contributing to political campaigns. We were hiring lobbyists and trying to get to Capitol Hill and have conversations with influential policymakers. I was surprised by how much impact we were able to have as a pretty small business, and emerging business. And I think that's partly because if you find the right people who can get you in the right doors, folks that have those personal connections to the power players in state government and in the state Senate or state House, that's super helpful. I also think we had a really good argument. We were and another thing that I found really interesting and a little surprising was that the work that I was doing didn't feel legal at all. I didn't feel like I was utilizing any of the lawyerly skill sets that I had learned either at Skadden or as an in-house counsel at Warby at that point. It was much more of a sales kind of role, and evangelist kind of role, company spokesperson. And what we would do was, depending on who we were talking to, if it was a state whose legislature was dominated by Republicans, we'd craft our argument that we thought would resonate with them. If it was a state that was dominated blue, we would craft our argument. If it was a state that was split, we'd have to give both arguments. And high level, on the right side of the aisle, for what we were advocating for, we tended to focus a lot on deregulation and trusting the doctors who went to medical school, did their residency, are board certified, have their licenses, and let's put trust in those professionals rather than having the government dictate to those professionals how they could treat their patients, what new technologies they feel are appropriate in treating their patients. And on the left side of the aisle, it was all about opening up access to healthcare, especially in communities that are struggling with healthcare access, both urban and rural communities. And it was all about affordability. Let's find ways for vision care specifically, to create accessible but also affordable vision care and prescription products. for people that might not be able to afford it in the traditional healthcare context.
I mean, this all really resonates with me. I started my career working on public policy in like the commercial drone space, and we had to go state by state. And very similar to you, we wanted to introduce our own model legislation, and we had to craft our arguments depending on what we thought would resonate and engage local representatives. I guess a question for you, and also an observation, maybe. A question would be, how do you do this on a small budget, like you said, as opposed to going to the CEO and saying, like, this is a bet the company deal, you need to give me millions of dollars. And then an observation just being, it remind us of the time period, but telehealth like this, I'm thinking of what we've lived through with COVID over the past 4+ years, right? I would just sort of think like the whole landscape around this now has maybe totally changed. And the argument around I should be able to get new glasses so that way I can see what's on my computer from my home office or from my living room, right? Like when you might not have been safe for you to leave your house, right? I mean, that, like, I would just think that today that would resonate maybe so much more, like you were early, almost in a sense.
Yes. I think today post-COVID, it's a lot easier to sit in a room with a state politician and have that politician understand why telehealth is important and what telehealth is. Back then, this is pre-COVID. It was a lot more challenging, and telehealth was still an active practice then in 2017, 2018. But most people thought telehealth as a basically Skype or a Zoom visit with your doctor when you're traveling or you're sick and you don't want to go into the doctor's office. Kind of like the conversation we're having right now with audio and video. What was really hard for a lot of folks to compute was how on earth could an eye doctor who's not having a face-to-face live conversation with their patient possibly know what this patient's prescription should be. So, and you have really limited time in those rooms. Maybe you have 10, 15 minutes. So, I was really fortunate to work with technology teams, data teams, and marketing teams to help craft what we thought were the most effective sound bites. Because I myself barely understood the technology as an attorney. So, and these politicians have so much on their plate, right? Some of them they're at the state level. Sometimes it's not even a full-time job. They have their attorneys, their doctors, right? They're doing this as a part-time gig. So they've really limited time and bandwidth to understand the patented technology that was built behind this really cool vision care tool. So that was part of the really interesting challenge of how do you explain what this is in a 10, 15 minute meeting where it's going to resonate that this is safe, this is the way of the future, this is good for my constituents, this is something I should support. How to back to your question about working with the executive team and the founders.
How do you,
We were fortunate that the issue, that this issue was not a bet the farm kind of policy. If there was a nationwide ban on this kind of remote vision care tool, it would have been really unfortunate. It would have limited what we thought was a future growth driver of the business, but it wouldn't have tanked the business. I don't think it would have materially harmed our ability to eventually go public or raise money. But it was still important to us. So we didn't have the pressure of, if these bills pass, our core business model, which was selling glasses online and in brick and mortar stores, that was not going to be impacted. So we did have, there was less anxiety around government. It was more of a nice to have. And then we would try to, a little bit more of an art than a science, that would try to make some sort of calculation on how important is the state to our business, Right. And that's typically population. We knew at that point, we knew where our stores were. We knew who was buying online from us, and we tend to put more weight and spend more time on states that were important to the business. And then after some initial discovery conversations with folks in those states on the ground, before we actually hired a lobbyist, we try to gauge what's the likelihood of success here. Are they dealing with serious budgetary issues? Are they dealing with like gun control? Are they dealing with other things in healthcare that are kind of in their eyes more important? And is this not an issue they want to take on this legislative calendar? And if we thought the likelihood is low that they'd even pay attention to us, that's a reason to not go into the state. And then one thing that I think this is not just at Warby, but kind of all startup founders grapple with is, do we even want to get on the government's radar? I know
Yes.
a lot of founders like just, and it makes a lot of sense. A lot of founders like staying quiet. If something passes that requires us to operationally make changes to our model, that impacts our business, we'll deal with it then. But we don't want to be the face of pushing policy forward because we just don't want to get on the government's radar. We were less concerned about that because we were very confident that what we were doing both on the e-commerce and brick and mortar side and on the virtual care side was medically sound and a great thing for the customers and for the country. So there was less concern there, but that's part of the calculation that I think a lot of CEOs and founders make of, is this the right time for the business to be being front and center in like the psyche of regulators and legislators?
I've had those conversations myself. Yeah.
Hey there, legal teams. Big news. SpotDraft's fall release is here, and it's our biggest update yet. With over 15 new features, it's packed with tools to make contracting faster and simpler for you. Want complete control over your workflows? You've got it with customizable approvals that actually fit your processes. Looking for clarity? Use SpotDraft's new analytics offering to uncover insights and find ways for your legal team to move faster. We've also made it easier to manage your agreements with the new Legal Hub, a straightforward way to publish and update terms online without waiting on IT or marketing. And here's the game changer. Our AI tools, like Verify, take on the boring stuff, contract reviews, and metadata extraction, so your team can focus on making decisions that matter. It's everything you need to manage your contracts your way. Check it out at spotdraft.com/fall-release. That's spotdraft.com/fall-release. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Let's talk about your time at Ro, which I think when you joined was called Roman. When you transitioned to that gig and decided to leave Warby, what were you most excited about taking on there and tackling there as their first legal hire?
Was really excited about working for another pioneer in an industry similar to Warby. Warby really felt like best in class, one of the first of its kind in direct-to-consumer e-commerce, digitally native brand. And it felt that same way in the early days at Ro, that we were defining a new category. So that was really exciting.
Yeah.
And not only defining a category for consumers, but defining it in a really quickly evolving, sometimes really unclear regulatory space. We were providing medical care on our platform. We owned and operated a number of pharmacies, mail order pharmacies. So when you see a doctor on the platform, if it was appropriate, the doctor or nurse decided a prescription was appropriate, our pharmacies would send you medication right to your doorstep. So there's telehealth law, scope of practice and malpractice issues. There are pharmacy laws and regulations, again, regulated differently state by state. FDA concerns, because we're doing a lot of advertising of healthcare and prescription products across various channels. There's this thing called the corporate practice of medicine, which is any healthcare lawyers listening out there, is these kind of arcane laws that say companies themselves are not permitted. This is in several states across the country, are not permitted to practice medicine themselves. So what you have to do is create this kind of convoluted corporate model where you're creating an entity that's owned and operated by a clinician. They are providing the care themselves, hiring the doctors, doing quality controls, training doctors, and that what's called a professional corporation. That professional corporation is then signing a services agreement with the for-profit corporation.
Got it.
So just a lot of different areas of law, mostly at the state level, some federal level with FDA, FTC, to keep it all straight. And that, for me, that was an exciting challenge. And I was really fortunate to come into an environment working and reporting to Zach Reitano, who's co-founder, CEO of Ro. And from the early days, he wanted to create a best-in-class legal and regulatory group in-house. Like that was he was. I think he was looking at it the right way, which is an innovative way, I think, for a lot of founders to look at legal. But he was looking at legal. How can his legal team be a strategic asset? We want the best and the brightest in-house who understand the business, understand the product, like live and breathe Ro and what we're building day in day, and use this complicated and evolving legal and regulatory landscape to our advantage. And that was a really cool philosophy, and that made me really excited and drew me into the company, and was then really fortunate to be able to build out a team of folks who, especially in healthcare, knew a lot more than I did about the space, and have a legal and regulatory team where I was surrounded by real experts that I could learn from.
So with that in mind, I guess, did you really have to make the case for government affairs hires? I mean, I'm sure to a certain extent you did. No CEO that I've ever worked with is willing to give you a blank check because they're always thinking about, how do I answer to my investors? How did you go about doing that? Like building the government affairs team, making the internal case for that budget, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I actually never hired anyone internally to do government affairs. I liked doing the work, so I didn't mind taking on a lot of it myself. And I just decided I wanted to cash those chips for lawyers on the team. So it was a combination of myself and external consultants. I got very fortunate when I joined the company. Tusk Strategies, which is a venture fund / regulatory advisory shop, were early investors in Ro, and I was very fortunately gifted a relationship with a regulatory consultant who is the best in the business at telehealth, legislative and regulatory issues. Her name's Quinn. Shout out to Quinn. She is the best. And she was like my Sherpa through across all of these issues, and really became my core partner in monitoring the landscape, mostly at the state level, and then helping assess when is the right time for us to engage, what are the right issues to engage on, and then once we decide to engage, what's the best strategy, who do we hire on the ground locally, when's the right time for me to fly to the state capitol and spend 2 days of full meetings, being the face of the company, introducing folks into Ro, into direct to consumer telehealth, and then we'd also take advantage of industry associations like the American Telemedicine Association. Sometimes we would decide not to engage because we knew that there were larger, better funded companies who were on our same side, and we were like, yeah, for this issue, we're okay free riding. We trust that we don't need more cooks in the kitchen on this issue. We really trust. And then for others, I made it a point to become really friendly with the GCs of our main competitors. And I learned this from the Uber Lyft model. They would share notes. What's going on? What are you guys working on? What are your concerns? And we would all talk. And sometimes I'd be like, yeah, you guys take this one. Like, trust you, you got it. And sometimes we'd say, we're going to hire up in this state and we're going to run with it. If you want to work together, or we're happy to do it alone. And that was kind of how I managed all of that.
How did you decide beyond that, maybe where you were going to engage or where you were going to spend most of your time, or were you going to be sort of more offensive in certain states versus more defensive? Like, I'm curious the decision making or the different factors that you were weighing there as you look across a somewhat complicated landscape, I guess. You listed out like 6 different areas where there was regulatory engagement.
Yeah. Ours was our key issue, at least in the first couple years, was around something called asynchronous telemedicine.
Okay.
So in a traditional telehealth consultation, like I said before, it's on Zoom. You're talking to your doctor. You're using audio and video. At Ro, for a lot of the conditions that we were treating and medications that we were prescribing to patients on the platform, we had designed a system where our providers were capable of treating patients asynchronously. So patient provides a host of medical history, host of symptoms, some biometric information, and each condition being treated, each medication being prescribed had its own standard of care and its own protocols that we'd go through. But for a lot of the help you can get online these days through telehealth, it can be done asynchronously. And when I first started at Ro, we'll call it maybe half the states allowed prescribing and treatment through asynchronous modalities, asynchronous technologies, and many required an audio and video communication. So for the offensive work, and these are in scenarios where doctors are saying, I'm going to meet the standard of care through asynchronous communications. I don't need to have a real-time face-to-face conversation in order for me to understand everything I need to know about this patient and treat them appropriately, like I would in an in-person clinical setting. So some of the proactive work what we would do was building relationships at states that had certain requirements that we thought went too far in the technologies that were allowed or not allowed to be used through telehealth. Offensive is it's a slower build. It's you're building relationships, you're establishing credibility with policymakers. And you're hoping that what you do is establish that expertise in your field, where the day that they're considering a policy that's related to your expertise, they're actually picking up the phone and calling you and saying, hey, I remember that meeting I had with Adam at Ro last year, talked about asynchronous telehealth. They seem like they know their shit, and they seem like they're doing really good things for patients. They really care about doing the right thing. They really care about expanding access and lowering costs and meeting patients where they are. I want their opinion on how I should be crafting this legislation. And that's the proactive work. We did that a lot in New York and California, naturally. Those states, you know this too, often when they pass laws, other states especially, as states that are dominated by Democrats or on the same side of the aisle, they will often take a look at what they're doing and follow suit, or be a catalyst for other states to look at policy. And then defensively, we had a pretty tight monitoring system where we would know instantly when something in our ballpark would get proposed. And similar to what I talked about at Warby, we try to make that calculation. Is this important enough? What else is going on at the company? Are we in the middle of a fundraise? Are we in the middle of an M&A deal? Are we launching new products? Is it worth our time and our team's bandwidth and what's our likelihood of success to go engage in that state.
I mean, here's a question for you, actually, about Ro in particular. Unlike eyeglasses, I mean, well, Ro started as like erectile dysfunction medication, right? And then it expanded to be a sort of suite of different brands, right? But you can think of the brands as often dealing with either sort of sexual health or other conditions that, I don't know, some legislators might be uncomfortable talking about. And at the time, I suppose maybe the world wasn't quite as politicized as it is today around some of this, but anything that you would share about how you dealt with tough questions from legislators or legislators who almost like, took the meeting, but then didn't really want to talk about it or engage with you, or also, I mean, you seem like a very, very comfortable person, right? But like how you get comfortable having that type of conversation with legislators over and over again. It's not talking about like optometry and cool red and blue, see-through glasses, right?
Yeah. It's a great question. I certainly, when looking back at myself in law school, didn't expect me as a general counsel sitting with state senators talking about erectile dysfunction and the benefits of Viagra and how it's prescribed on the internet. I didn't expect that for my career, but for us, it always started with the medicine. We Ro as a company had medical DNA in its blood since the day that the company was founded. So we would, and that was how we handled it internally too. These aren't things to joke around about or make like little snide comments at. This is healthcare. Everything had a medical basis to it. Everything had research behind it. We took the medical route really, really seriously. So that's always kind of what our starting point was, like providing good care, helping people where they have needs, even if those needs are stigmatized and embarrassing for them. I mean, that was one of the great value propositions of a company like Ro is if you're embarrassed to talk to your doctor about some of these issues, this is a judgment-free zone. What we tried to do was, bring down some of that stigma on some of these conditions. So, but for me, who at the company, I talked about it all day, every day, it became so natural. Sometimes I'd have to check myself and recognize that someone I'm across the table from, like a politician, might not be so comfortable talking about it. So we would stick to the medicine as much as possible. And what I always when I traveled to state capitals and would often testify in front of a panel or a committee at the House or the Senate, realized pretty quickly that no one really wants to hear from the lawyer. Like I'm just a company lawyer. So begged our awesome chief medical officer to please come with me and please travel with me. I had that, I could shut up and, I could talk about the policy, but then shut up and actually have someone who is a trained medical professional, a doctor, talk about the medicine. And it was always really helpful to have doctors with me. I'll give one example though of how we, in some of the government affairs work, destigmatized it and actually got a lot of interest from politicians in one state, Minnesota. There was a law in the books since the early 2000s that really was meant to address these pill mills online where you can plug in your name, your address, and your credit card information, and they'll send you just about anything, including opioids. And there was a lot of overdoses during that time period. And states and federal government, the DEA, enacted a lot of policy and a lot of legislation to address it. In Minnesota's law, unsure how this happened, but erectile dysfunction medication got added to the list of drugs that were illegal to prescribe online. Interesting. Paired with a number of dangerous drugs that made sense. And so we were blocked from operating in that product line in Minnesota for a while, and we decided to offensively build relationships, go to the state, several times, and kind of figure out what was going on there and see if there was appetite to do something about that, especially as a company like Ro had really flourished and had done some incredible things and had really positive health outcomes for patients. And the thing that actually, I think, tipped it over the edge where folks started taking it seriously, we presented data on the prevalence of erectile dysfunction in military vets. And then presented data on lack of access for those military vets to get the care that they need for ED. And that kind of won the day for us. And we ended up partnering with some legislators and stripping ED medication from that bill and opening up that market for the company. But trying to find issues and real data that resonate with what legislators care about is pretty critical.
Yeah, I mean, that strikes me as potentially one of the core advantages that's inherent to running a sort of like consumer focused brand or a D2C brand. I mean, obviously there are then risks to consumers as opposed to businesses, right? And we know legislators and regulators probably care more about risks to people and their health and their livelihoods and they do about how two businesses are transacting with each other. So you might be on the radar of more regulators, but there is that sort of built-in advantage, right? Of, okay, when we're going out and we're trying to lobby for something or trying to do something offensively, we can marshal these human stories as opposed to look at the numbers or look at the sort of abstract numbers of job growth in your district. I'm curious, talk to us a little bit about that and what was interesting to you, or what you see as the differences between working for a D2C brand as opposed to a B2B brand.
Yeah, D2C, it's a double-edged sword. If you're providing great service and great products and your customers and patients love you, they could be a real asset in policy work or a great asset in PR work.
Yeah.
Right. It's but the other side of the coin is if you're not, and there are complaints, people feel like they were taken advantage of, they were overcharged, they didn't get what was promised to them. The opposite is true, where complaints, Better Business Bureau complaints to the FTC, those are the things that if there's a groundswell of a lot of consumer complaints, those are the things that end up getting on certainly plaintiffs' attorneys, but on regulators' radars as well, right? So then you're known to them for reasons you don't want to be known to them. So there are pros and cons to that. I've thankfully worked now for 3 very consumer-oriented businesses, right? Whose the North Star is to create a positive consumer or patient experience. So I've fortunately been able to deal with a lot of the positives of working for a consumer business and leverage great stories, great health outcomes. And when that's the case, it certainly helps your policy work. You
mentioned bringing the CMO in, Chief Medical Officer in, as opposed to Chief Marketing Officer, to your work at Ro. Talk to me just a little bit about how much the CEO needs to be involved in government affairs work in your experience, either from a sort of like setting the strategy perspective or from an actual, okay, we're going to do a day where the CEO comes in and meets with folks. And how do you think, what's the right way to manage that relationship?
I think on state level issues, probably not required very much unless the CEO just has a personal interest and wants to get in the mix.
Yeah.
But a lot of the tactical work, right? Like creating a one-pager, going to the state capitol, setting up 2 straight days of 15 meetings each day, probably not necessary. Again, we weren't dealing with bet the farm kind of issues. So maybe if the company's lifeline depended on how a certain bill went, maybe the CEO gets a little bit more involved. We would coordinate on it, and the decision to go engage in a state was certainly a decision we would make together. How much bandwidth do we have? Sometimes when you're engaging on public policy matters, it's a lot of it behind the scenes, but sometimes, especially for like sexier issues, and I don't think telehealth is that sexy, but some reporters thought it was. There would be media on it, or someone would report on my testimony in front of the New Hampshire Senate, right, about asynchronous telehealth. So just to be prepared for that, and then if there were media, if the CEO was giving an interview or there was media coming out, sometimes we strategically talk about, does it make sense to talk about some of the policy and government affairs efforts to shine a light on what we're doing? So we coordinate a little bit in that way. I think if you're in DC and working on high level DC matters, you maybe want to get the founders and the executives a little bit more involved.
Can you tell us, I know you're advising a number of different startups, serving as a sort of fractional GC or outside GC to them. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're up to now since leaving Blank Street a few months ago?
Yeah, it's been a transition period.
Yeah.
It's been fun. I'm working primarily with digital health startups, some in a non-legal consulting and advisory capacity, some in a legal fractional general counsel role. It's been fun work. Feels like it's not outside counsel. It's not totally full-time general counsel. So it's somewhere in the middle, but it's allowed me to have relationships with multiple companies at the same time and work on a great diversity of issues. Truthfully, I don't know if it's something I want to do long-term.
Yeah.
It feels like it's kind of like a transitional period stopover for me until I figure out what I want to do next. But it's been surprisingly fun to do something a little bit different than what I had been doing for the past decade, which was one client, one company, in it all day, every day, right? One mission to work on a variety of different things at the same time.
And okay, some fun questions for you. I like this part.
Right.
What's your favorite part of your day-to-day? And you can take this either now or when you were working as a full-time GC.
As a full-time GC, I think it was talking to my team. Syncing up with folks on my team. I think I've done the solo GC thing before. At Blank Street for a period of time, at Ro for a period of time, at Warby. It could be an isolating gig.
Yeah.
And if you're lucky enough as a GC to have a team, I just loved spending time with them. I was at Ro really fortunate to build and be surrounded by incredible people and incredible lawyers that I learned a ton from. And I just loved just bouncing ideas off each other, having that internal resource to call and say, am I thinking about this the right way? Am I crazy here? Like, can you help, play devil's advocate for a second, I really loved building those relationships with the team internally.
See, what I love about that is, now, maybe for some of our listeners, think about if you're like on Adam's team or you're someone who's on a team with someone like Adam and you're hearing that. Maybe you don't hear that all the time from your boss, right? Like your boss or your GC might actually be showing up to work super excited to pick your brain. I feel like that doesn't get said enough, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and often your GC is just as confused as you are, right? Like it's just there's no playbook here, and I'm often encountering questions for the first time in my career still, and it's nice to have the relationship with your team where you could say like, I don't know what the fuck to do. What do you think we should do? Let's figure it out together. Come on, this is fun. So that's kind of how I've managed those relationships. I don't think that I don't think there's a GC out there who still doesn't get kind of smacked in the face with things that they don't know anything about or how to navigate it. And having friends and colleagues who you could coordinate with and brainstorm with is invaluable.
Do you have a professional pet peeve?
I think a couple. It's weird that both are email related. Not doing a once over to check for grammar or spelling before you send an email. There will be typos. There will be that's natural, right? Not looking for perfection, but the once over. The judge that I clerked for in the Ninth Circuit is so hardcore when it comes to grammar and spelling and punctuation. I think he just instilled it in me that it matters. It's it influences how your email would be perceived and read on the other end. So I think just doing a once over before it's sent. And then the email forward without any context, like the see below, when are just months worth of back and forth, and what am I supposed to do with this? I think that's a pet peeve of mine too.
That should be everyone's pet peeve. I agree with that. Maybe you've had a little bit of time to read as you've been advising different companies recently. I'm a big reader, and I love to ask all of our guests for book recommendations. If you have one or two that you'd want to share with our listeners.
Sure. I recently reread Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Heavy stuff. Not a fun book, but meaningful to me. It was a book that my grandfather gave me. I still have the copy he gave me, and every once in a while I reread it.
Who's that by? You said
Viktor Frankl, who's
Viktor Frankl. All right,
Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist.
Interesting.
Kind of his recollection and then kind of clinical theories about how he's approached his work after surviving.
Wow, that sounds like a good read for, I don't know, not a beach vacation, but like an hour before bed every night for 2 weeks to like really remind yourself maybe even also how lucky you are. And
then lately, I must admit, I've been doing a lot of reading on Twitter, and I've been a lot of doom scrolling, and it's a good reminder. So thank you that I maybe should put that down and pick up a book. But yeah, it's a lot of time spent scrolling lately.
Okay. Last question for you, Adam. My sort of traditional closing question for guests on the podcast. And that's, if you could look back on your days of being a young lawyer, maybe at Skadden, just getting started, something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then.
It's a good one. I'd go back a bit further to law school. And I would have told myself, being a lawyer does not necessarily mean you're a litigator. That's what it looks like on TV most of the time. But there is there are a plethora of options out there other than going to law school and going to be a litigator or law firm. I just kind of assumed that's what it was and hadn't spent much time exploring what other careers could look like. I think I eventually got pretty circuitously to the place where I'm really happy and I really love the profession, but hadn't even occurred to me back then that what I'm doing now was a possibility.
Thanks so much for joining me today. It was great to see you, Adam. This has been a lot of fun.
You too. Thanks for having me.
And to all of our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of The Abstract, and we hope to see you next time.